Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
We've noticed a lot of you are tuning in, which is amazing, but I haven't quite hit that subscribe button yet.
Yeah, and that little button, honestly, it's so small, but it makes such a huge difference in helping us reach more people with these important discussions.
Right. It's true. Like the algorithms, those mysterious forces that decide what we all see and hear, they pay a lot of attention to subscriber numbers.
Yeah, think of it like the subscribing. It's like casting a vote for quality content, So these insightful research discussions don't just get lost in the sea of all the information out there.
More subscribers equals more visibility. Right. And that means more resources for us to make even deeper dives for you.
Yeah.
Maybe bring in experts for interviews, even do some live Q&A sessions where you can jump in.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about building a community around research,
Yeah.
where curiosity thrives and knowledge is like shared and debated. Today we're taking a look at something that really shapes what we think we know, especially in economics, and that's the peer review process for academic journals.
Oh, yeah.
We've got some pretty fascinating material to draw on here, primarily a 2017 article from the Journal of Economic Perspectives. It's titled, How to Write an Effective Referee Report and Improve the Scientific Review Process.
Okay.
So kind of think of this as like a behind-the-scenes look at how influential economic ideas get vetted before they actually make it into a published journal. And this is for you, the learner, whether you're, deep in a field that relies on this kind of research, or you're just kind of curious how we decide what's, real expertise and what's not. What are the hallmarks of good reviewing? Or sometimes, even more interestingly, what makes for bad reviewing?
Right.
Because it turns out this process actually has a huge impact on the knowledge that we all end up sort of taking in and accepting.
Absolutely. I mean, how economic research gets reviewed and scrutinized really does dictate what knowledge is considered credible and, gets circulated. And the authors of this article, Jonathan Berk, Campbell Harvey, and David Hirschleifer, I mean, they really bring a wealth of experience here. They've served as editors at leading journals like the Journal of Finance and the Review of Financial Studies.
Wow. And
they've also drawn on, conversations they've had with former editors of other top publications, the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, Econometrica. I mean, this is really giving us an informed look behind the curtain here.
Yeah, wow, that's an all-star lineup of economic thinkers there. So, okay, let's unpack some of this. One of the first things that really jumped out at me is how much more involved the review process has become over time. It's not like back in the day. There's this growing expectation for more and more revisions, and the papers themselves have gotten so much longer, often with tons of extra analyses packed in. The article actually mentions some research from Card and Della Vigna in 2013, and they showed that recent papers in economics, they're like 3 times longer than they were back in the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
And that's not even including all the the extra stuff that gets pushed into online appendices. It makes you wonder, is all that extra length really adding value?
That's a great point, and that's exactly one of the things that this article brings up. Are we really getting better research by demanding more and more revisions and longer papers? The authors, they actually suggest that maybe a lot of researchers' time is being spent on revisions that don't really fundamentally improve the core findings of the paper. They even reference a model by Ellison from 2002 that suggests that maybe there are evolving social norms within academia. Kind of this increasing pressure to ask for and to provide more and more revisions. And what's interesting here is that, maybe this trend isn't actually driven by like a pure desire for, absolute perfection in the research, but by, other factors, other things going on within the academic ecosystem.
Yeah. It's almost like, I don't know, maybe referees feel like they have to prove to the editors that they're really being rigorous, like they need to find flaws in the papers they review to justify their role, and that can actually lead to minor issues getting kind of blown out of proportion, right? Like a small thing turns into this seemingly critical problem.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, this kind of pressure can inadvertently shift the focus away from the paper's main contribution,
right?
Its potential impact, and instead the focus becomes, addressing this laundry list of relatively minor points. And for you, the learner, this raises a really interesting question about the efficiency of academic research, right?
Yeah.
Is the current system, is it the best way to use researchers' time and effort? Right. Or, is a significant portion of it really just going towards, ticking boxes rather than actually pushing the boundaries of what we know?
Yeah, I mean, it's like we all want quality research, but are we sacrificing, the big picture for these small details? It's an interesting question.
It is.
Okay, so another really eye-opening point that the authors bring up is the amount of disagreement that often exists between different referees who are reviewing the same paper.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd think, experts in a field would more or less agree on the merits and weaknesses of a particular piece of research, right?
Yeah, you would think so, yeah.
But the evidence they present suggests that that's often not the case.
Yeah, that's right. They actually cite a 2014 study by Welch, and it looked at 8 leading economics and finance journals. And what they found was really striking. The chance of one referee recommending a revision was only slightly higher if another referee had already recommended it.
Wow.
And it wasn't just like subtle differences of opinion either. The article mentions another study, this one from a major finance conference, and the correlation between different referees' recommendations. It was only 0.28.
Wow, that's incredibly low.
Yeah, and that really highlights how much randomness there is in this process, right?
Yeah.
Like who ends up reviewing your paper could really have a huge impact on whether it gets published or not.
Yeah. It's almost like, rolling the dice, It's like you're at the mercy of who ends up with your paper.
Right. For you, the learner, this might suggest that the journey of an academic paper from submission to publication, it's not always this clear-cut objective evaluation.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So based on, their expensive experience and all these conversations with these journal editors, the authors identify several kind of key problem areas in the way academic refereeing is often done. So let's dive into those. Starting with how referees sort of weigh the importance and innovativeness of a paper.
Okay, yeah, this is a really important area. So the editors they talked to, they noticed a tendency for referees to get really fixated on small, relatively minor flaws. Mm-hmm. Even in papers that were addressing like really big, really innovative questions. It's like being so focused on a tiny scratch on a brand new groundbreaking invention that you miss the big picture.
Right.
You miss the overall potential of the thing.
Yeah, it reminds me they actually quote Kenneth Arrow in the article from way back in 1995.
Oh, wow.
And he talks about this, what he calls a conservative tendency in major journals, where there's this preference for like small incremental improvements on existing work rather than, really radical new ideas. And that really resonates with me. It can feel a lot safer to critique something that's just building on what we already know.
Right.
Than to, really grapple with something totally new and potentially game-changing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this raises a really important question. How do we as a research community encourage genuinely innovative work if the review process itself tends to favor the more conventional approaches?
Right.
And I think the advice that they offer here to referees is really valuable. When you encounter a paper that's tackling a big, important issue, don't just dismiss it because it has some flaws.
Right.
The real question is whether those flaws invalidate the central contribution of the paper.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, we have to be open to new ways of thinking, even if they're not perfectly polished right out of the gate.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And they suggest a really helpful heuristic for referees to use.
Okay.
After reading the paper, flaws and all, ask yourself, would I have been pleased to have written this?
Oh, okay.
And if the answer is yes, that's a strong signal that the paper, it probably deserves serious consideration for publication, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah. It's about recognizing the potential impact, even if the execution isn't flawless.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a really good point. Okay, so the second kind of major problem they highlight is this often unclear distinction between essential comments that have to be addressed for a paper to be publishable and sort of more minor suggestions for improvement.
Right.
And they have this term that I think is really, really descriptive. They call it signal jamming.
Signal jamming, yeah.
And what that means is when referees emphasize relatively small issues, maybe to appear more insightful or thorough thorough to the editor.
Right.
And apparently this can actually contribute to this trend that we talked about earlier, papers getting longer and longer.
Right. It's almost like a performance of critical thinking, where the reviewer feels like they need to generate this long list of points, even if a lot of them are kind of trivial. And the author suggests that maybe, the fact that there are so many academics now might be making this worse. As the field has grown, it's harder for editors to, personally evaluate the quality of every single referee report.
Right.
So referees might feel even more pressure to demonstrate their value through, providing lots and lots of feedback, even if it includes a lot of nitpicking.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then the unintended consequence of that is that the more ambitious, potentially groundbreaking papers might actually get overlooked in favor of more routine ones that just happen to look cleaner.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like there's this demand for superficial perfection rather than, really deep substantive contributions.
Right. And that's really unfortunate because we want to encourage those bold ideas. So, okay, so what's the solution here? What do the authors recommend?
Well, they have some really practical advice. They say that referee reports should really clearly separate two types of feedback.
Okay.
First, the issues that are non-negotiable. Mm-hmm. The problems that absolutely have to be addressed for the paper to even be considered publishable.
Right.
And then second, the suggestions that are more optional.
Okay.
Things that the authors might want to consider, but that won't necessarily prevent the paper from being published. And that kind of clear separation, it seems like it would be really helpful, for both the authors and the editors to kind of navigate the revision process more effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And they also really stress that these must address comments. The non-negotiables, they have to be grounded in solid, scientifically sound reasoning. You can't just say, I don't believe this or this doesn't feel right to me, like what they jokingly refer to as failing the smell test.
Yeah, the smell test. They give some examples of insufficient justifications, Things like, I do not believe the proof, or the empirical results do not pass the smell test. These kinds of statements, they don't actually explain why the referee has these concerns.
Right. It's not enough to just say you disagree. You have to say, this is why I disagree, based on this established principle or this piece of evidence.
Exactly. And if there's a problem with a mathematical proof, the referee should point to the specific step in the logic that seems flawed.
Right.
Or maybe offer a counterexample. And similarly with empirical work, if the findings seem surprising, it's totally reasonable to ask for more evidence or robustness checks. But again, it should be framed as something that's necessary for the validity of the conclusions.
Right.
Not just a feeling or a hunch.
And they make a really crucial point, I think, about respecting the author's intellectual freedom. On those optional suggestions, those non-essential things, the authors should have the freedom to present their ideas in the way they think is best.
Right.
It's not about forcing them to conform to the referee's particular preferences.
Exactly. Unless a comment directly affects the validity or the contribution of the paper, referees shouldn't hold the paper hostage over things like stylistic preferences or demands for endless additional analyses that don't really change the core message of the paper.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay.
So the third kind of central issue that they discuss is what they call breaching the implicit contract of revise and resubmit. And this sounds like a situation that could be super frustrating for authors who've already put in a lot of work based on the initial feedback, right?
Oh, absolutely. It can be incredibly frustrating. So the understanding here, the implicit agreement, is that when a referee recommends revise and resubmit, they're essentially saying three things. One, the paper has the potential to be important.
Right.
Two, the problems they've identified are probably fixable.
Okay.
And three, the paper is a potential good fit for the journal.
So it's like a conditional thumbs up, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
With the understanding that if the authors address those concerns, the paper will move towards publication.
Right. But what happens when that doesn't happen? When that expectation is kind of violated?
Right. So the authors, they caution against introducing completely new major issues in subsequent rounds of review after a revise and resubmit has been granted, the bulk of the critical feedback should really be given in that first report.
Okay.
And they also emphasize that editors and referees need to think carefully about the cost and benefit of any additional revision requests. They give this really compelling example of a referee who insisted that the authors add one more year of data to their analysis.
Oh, wow.
Which would have been, super time consuming, but was very unlikely to change the core findings in any meaningful way.
Right.
So editors need to be really vigilant about this kind of, make work.
Yeah. And the goal is to keep the research moving forward, right?
Right.
So ideally, a paper that gets a revise and resubmit, it should only need one more round of review before a final decision is made.
Exactly.
And they also talk about this practice that sounds particularly bad, which is rejecting a revised paper for what they call insufficient incremental contribution.
Right.
If that wasn't even mentioned as a major concern in the initial review, it's
right.
like, you're moving the goalposts after the authors have, put in all this effort to address the initial feedback.
Exactly. It really undermines the integrity of the whole review process. Yeah. It's not fair to the authors. Okay, so beyond these kind of central challenges, the article also touches on several other important aspects of being a good referee. And one of the first ones is something we can all probably relate to in different contexts, which is declining invitations.
Oh, yeah, declining invitations. It might seem like a small thing, but the authors, they really emphasize how important it is to respond promptly if you can't meet the review deadline.
Right.
And even to offer suggestions for alternative reviewers.
Oh, okay.
Who might be a better fit for the paper. Editors, they don't always have a complete picture of who the experts are in every single subfield.
Right.
So thoughtful suggestions from potential referees can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And on the flip side, agreeing to do a review and then submitting it super late or not submitting it at all, that reflects really poorly on the referee and slows down the whole process. Absolutely. It's always better to be upfront about your availability and your expertise than to, leave the editor hanging.
Yeah.
They also advise referees to really think about whether they're actually a good fit for the paper in the first place.
Right.
If you read the abstract or you start reading the paper and you realize, what, I don't actually have the necessary expertise in this particular area.
Right.
It's best to let the editor know that so they can find someone who is a better match.
Yeah, absolutely. And similarly, if a referee has already reviewed the same paper for a different journal, it's important to tell the editor about that.
Oh, okay.
Some editors might prefer to get a fresh perspective, while others might find the prior review history to be helpful.
Right.
And anonymity in the review process is another interesting point they bring up.
Mm-hmm.
So if a referee feels like they wouldn't be able to remain anonymous for whatever reason, they can decline the invitation to review. And, if a referee is currently working on research that significantly overlaps with the submitted paper, that's a potential conflict of interest.
Right.
And they absolutely have to disclose that to the editor.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about submissions that are just, clearly not a good fit for the journal, in terms of their scope or quality standards?
Yeah. In those cases, the authors suggest that a short, scientifically justified rejection is perfectly acceptable.
Okay.
And it should be done quickly.
Right.
There's no need to spend a lot of time on a detailed analysis if the paper is clearly below the bar or if it's just not in the right area.
Okay. And then they also talk about the cover letter that goes along with the referee report.
Right.
And it seems like that plays a surprisingly important role.
Yeah, it does. So they explain that the cover letter should provide a concise summary of the paper's main contribution and the reasoning behind the referee's recommendation.
Okay.
And shouldn't just be copy and paste of the full report.
Right.
And most importantly, the recommendation in the cover letter needs to match the detailed feedback in the report.
Okay.
Imagine an editor getting a report with mostly positive comments, but then the cover letter recommends rejection.
Right.
That just creates confusion.
Yeah, absolutely. So what should the cover letter ideally contain?
Well, they say it should briefly address the broad interest and importance of the paper.
Okay.
Whether the author's analysis is convincing, and then offer a clear and decisive recommendation regarding publishability.
Okay. Yeah, no waffling.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Ambiguity is not helpful for the editor. And they also talk about, when it's appropriate to suggest a second opinion to the editor.
Okay.
This could be useful in cases where the referee feels uncertain.
Yeah.
Or maybe the paper covers several different areas of expertise.
Right. Okay, so another interesting point they make is about the length of the referee report itself.
Oh, yeah. Especially given our earlier discussion about papers getting so long these days.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what's the ideal length for a good referee report?
Well, the article emphasizes that being concise and insightful is way more valuable than just writing a really long report.
Okay.
And they suggest that, a well-structured report around 2 to 3 pages should usually be enough to get the main points across.
Okay.
Unless, of course, there are really technical or complex issues that need a more detailed explanation.
Right.
And long reports can be a real burden for editors to process. They also suggest numbering the comments in the report, just for clarity.
Okay.
And clearly separating the major problems that need to be fixed from those more minor suggestions.
Okay. So, finally, and maybe most importantly for the integrity of the whole academic process,
right.
they talk about the ethical responsibilities of being a referee.
Yes, this is really the cornerstone of the whole thing.
Absolutely.
So the prompt and transparent disclosure of any potential conflicts of interest is absolutely crucial.
Okay.
This includes things like co-authorship with the authors, being colleagues at the same institution,
Okay.
having a former student or advisor as an author,
Right.
close personal relationships,
Okay.
financial ties to the research,
Right.
or even competing research projects.
Yeah.
Anything that could reasonably be seen as biasing the referee's assessment has to be brought to the editor's attention.
Absolutely. And obviously any kind of manipulation for personal gain is unethical.
Oh, of course, yeah. That could include things like pressuring authors to add unnecessary citations to the referee's own work.
Right.
Or deliberately delaying the review of a paper on a hot topic so that the referee can gain an advantage in their own research.
Right. They actually give this really concerning example, a referee who intentionally stalled the review of a really promising paper in their field.
Wow.
And then subsequently published their own work on a very similar topic.
Wow, that's really bad.
Yeah. It really undermines trust in the whole system. So what about the ethics of using ideas from a submitted paper during the review process?
Right. So if the paper hasn't been made public yet, it's unethical for a referee to use those ideas or findings in their own research.
Okay.
Because, the original authors haven't had a chance to share their work and get credit for it.
Right.
But if the paper is already publicly available, like as a working paper, then it's generally okay to work on the same topic.
Okay.
But you have to properly cite the original author's work.
Of course.
And they really warn against any kind of gaming the system. They say it can have serious long-term consequences for a referee's reputation.
Yeah, it's not worth it. Okay, so the last piece of advice they offer is about just basic professional courtesy.
Right.
And it might seem obvious, but maybe it's worth repeating given how much is at stake in academic careers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So they emphasize the importance of being courteous and substantive in the referee report. No personal attacks, no accusations of bad intent, no insults, no overly emotional language.
Right.
If there are concerns about intellectual dishonesty, the advice is to stick to the facts.
Right.
Don't speculate about the author's motives.
Right.
And finally, it's really important for referees to be aware of their own potential biases, conscious or unconscious.
Yeah.
And to avoid giving undue favor to authors based on their reputation or their citation count,
Right.
the focus should be on the merits of the research itself.
Absolutely. So for you, the learner, what are the key takeaways from all this? This deep dive into the often unseen world of academic peer review in economics.
Well, I think the main takeaway is that, while it's a really important process for ensuring the quality and the credibility of research, academic peer review is still a human endeavor. And as such, it's prone to certain biases and inefficiencies. But as we've seen, there are some clear principles and best practices that aim to promote, effective, fair, and ethical evaluation of scholarly work.
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest takeaway is just how much these, behind the scenes dynamics can actually shape the knowledge that we end up accepting as valid and important,
Right.
you know, in economics and really in any field.
Absolutely.
It's a complex system, and it might not be perfect, but understanding how it works is really valuable.
Yeah. And it leads to a final thought that I want to leave you with, the learner.
Okay.
You know, given all the human elements involved and the potential for both brilliance and bias and peer review, what does this say about the nature of truth? You know, the truth that we accept in different academic disciplines, and what's our responsibility as individuals to, you know, think critically about the information we encounter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even when it comes from, you know, seemingly authoritative sources. That's a powerful question to think about.
It is.
And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, the learner, I really encourage you to explore the literature on how scientific knowledge is developed and validated. It's a fascinating area of study.
Yeah, it really is. And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.